The Russian regime has invested massively in an enormous system of disinformation, television stations in multiple languages, websites, fake think tanks, and a vast army of internet trolls whose work is now well documented, whose efforts are designed to create chaos and confusion. This isn't traditional propaganda. It's not about saying that Russia's a great country. No, when a Malaysian plane was shot down by a Russian missile over eastern Ukraine last summer, the Russian media responded with multiple absurd conspiracy theories. For example, that the plane was full of dead people when it took off. But even on an ordinary day, Russia Today, the Russian English language channel, is capable of reporting on the CIA's invention of Ebola. The point of these stories is to create a fog of disinformation so that no one knows anymore what is true and what is not. How can we break through this fog and shore up our traditions of objective reporting? Yes, we have to disengage and isolate. Let's work harder to identify Russian lies and get them out of our media. You'll note that I haven't yet mentioned Ukraine. That's because you can't understand the recent crisis there unless you understand the true nature of the Russian regime I've just described. For 2 decades now, Russia has maintained control over Ukraine by investing in politicians, companies, and disinformation. Putin hoped to create in Ukraine a copycat colonial version of the political system he invented in Russia, and he almost succeeded. We need to make Putin pay a high price for invading a neighbor so that he doesn't invade another one. And the best way to do this is through disengagement and isolation in this sense. Isolate Russian money, isolate Russian oligarchs, isolate malign Russian political influence and propaganda. Prevent Russian violence and corruption from distorting the politics of Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and North America. Putinism is a danger to Russians and to Ukrainians and all of us. What we've discovered is that it has evolved into something really quite different. I mean, it's not the Soviet Union. It's very different from the Soviet Union. Actually, Soviet analogies are wrong. It's not Nazi Germany either. You know, these are bad analogies. It's a very new kind of very, very sophisticated propaganda-run state. You know, this is a country in which every single television channel and every single newspaper and almost every single internet website, with a few tiny exceptions, are controlled by the state and in such a way that they appear to be all slightly different. This is not one Pravda saying one thing every day. This is a wide spectrum of different media, and they all say the same thing in a tabloid way, in a sophisticated way, in an entertainment way, or in a news way. They're telling people the same stories that Putin wants them to hear. And the story they've been telling for the last many months actually now, is bitterly anti-American, bitterly anti-European, and now very close to becoming warmongering in a way that I never even remember even from a year ago. The hatred towards Ukraine, the hatred towards Americans, the use of semi-fascist symbolism and people marching and angered faces, this is something really, really new and different. Russia is not a country that wants stability. Russia is a country that is interested in chaos. It created chaos in Ukraine. Who are Russia's friends?
Yeah,
it backed Assad.
Let's bring Gary into this, because, I mean, Gary, some would point to the recent Iran deal.
Russia has been supplying Iran with nuclear technology. And then, let's not forget, this uranium goes to Russia. So Russia will basically hold the key. So it enhances Putin's position in the international arena. And let's not also forget, this negotiation went forever. And Putin's interest was always to keep a pressure in the region, because it helped to also push up the oil prices, which were vital to Putin's financial survival. As for Syria, Putin's priority from day one was to save mass murderer named Bashar al-Assad, and he succeeded. So there are many other reasons, you know, for him doing that. One is probably some form of dictator's brotherhood, and after so many dictators were washed away by the public anger in the Arab world, he didn't want to allow Assad to be toppled, because it always had a negative effect for people in Russia, because they could see that, you know, dictators, you know, also vulnerable. But also, let's not forget, you know, Putin is always watching, you know, for the map of the pipelines. They're very important, because that was his grip on Europe, you know, demanding that Europe could do this and that, otherwise he can cut gas supply. Potentially, Syria is vital for Qatar, Iraq, Syria, Turkey pipeline, which could make Russian Gazprom redundant. So in both cases, Putin played the role of a savior, you know, white knight at the 11th hour, but he was the greatest beneficiary.
In this long period of time, while Russia was rebuilding its military, while it was invading one neighbor after another, the American army was drawing down its European forces, so much so that by 2013, there was not one single American tank in Europe. This is an aggressive policy. There is no way that Putin believed in a genuine military threat from NATO. This is something that he has been using at home as a way to consolidate his power.
Okay.
And then another myth, of course, which I hear repeatedly: Putin is very popular. And whoever, Levada Center, I don't want to argue with you about the integrity. Yes, I agree. I give them full credit. Now, what is an opinion poll? Somebody calls you anonymously and asks, what do you think about Mr. Putin? That's an opinion poll.
No.
No, I'm really proud for my country that there are 20% of people who say they don't like Putin to a potentially KGB agent who's calling them. I spoke to people who fought in the Eastern Front. Who could have imagined that there was the front east of Kiev? Most of them are ethnic Russians. Russians from Kharkov, from the Dnipropetrovsk. They are fighting Putin's invading armies because they don't want to live in Putin's Russia. This is the Russia I want to see.
One of the other elements of NATO expansion that was very important was an agreement not to move nuclear missiles, an agreement which the West has kept. We are afraid that this is an irrational country. It might sell nuclear weapons to other people, one of you said. It might, we don't know what it might do. It might run off the, run off the ranch and do something crazy. What is the way in the past in which we've dealt with a country like that? It's called deterrence. Deterrence is not an aggressive policy. It is not an offensive policy. It is defense. The deterrence argument is, if you bomb us, we will bomb you back. It's very unattractive as a policy, and no one likes it. It's mutually assured destruction, Dr. Strangelove. It's a horrible thought. But given that this is the only policy we have that we know that works, and the only policy that we are capable of using now towards Putin's Russia, which does not want to be engaged with us anymore, which pumps out propaganda against us in all kinds of different ways, in all kinds of countries, whether it's, as you say, funding the Czech president's election, whether it's funding the far right in France. This is a country that doesn't want to be part of our system anymore and has made that very clear. What can we do? We can deter. We can make sure that Putin knows, that the Russian regime knows, and it is Putin and a tiny, and the word cronies, by the way, is an important one. Because what are they? They're just rich guys who are his friends, but somehow they're very powerful. What other word do we have to describe them? What we need is to make sure that that group of people knows that we would respond. That's the only thing we can do now. We don't have a better policy than that, and I'm very sorry. And in some ways, it's one of the great tragedies of my life. I've watched all this happen. I wrote a history of the Soviet Union. I watched the transition happen, and now we're back to exactly the place I would never have wanted us to be.
Not the place.
But this is not an isolation of Russia. This is isolation of a dictator.
Ukraine is not Putin's only target. He also wants to undermine our societies, corrupt our politicians, spread conspiracies inside our media. He hopes to persuade Europeans to succumb to the old temptations of the fascist far right. To stop this from happening, to stop him from destroying Ukraine, we need to isolate Russia in this sense. Enforce our own corruption laws, disentangle ourselves from the drug of Russian money, and reestablish the Western solidarity which he's trying to destroy.